It's good to see you. If you see me, hope you hear me okay. Less concerned about the seeing than the hearing. So here we are going to continue the discussion from the last message. In the previous video, I spoke to you about the beginnings of setting your strategic plan in motion, how to begin creating your strategic plan, the importance of having a strategic plan, how to go about establishing your goals for that strategic plan, making sure you write it down, and that you include all of the stakeholders in the discussion. And I mentioned a little bit about where to get things like funding, if you happen to need that, in order to enable your strategic plan to go ahead and launch. If you are, so now if you watch that video and you're caught up, you know that the next step in creating your strategic plan involves setting your benchmarks. Okay, and I spoke to you earlier briefly about if you set your benchmarks from a deficit to recover to zero before you can run ahead forward, or if you're starting out at zero, either way, it doesn't matter. In the sense of you still need to set benchmarks, right? Of course, it makes a difference in terms of which benchmarks you set. So one of them may be you need to get funding, and whether or not you get the funding, and that's clearly the benchmark with milestones. Milestones can be number of emails sent, phone calls made, meetings held, online meetings held, etc., etc. Secondary appointments, follow-up emails, follow-up phone calls, sending out documents, making sure that the right back and forth is happening, making sure that you're able to receive the funds in an account somewhere, whether it's a bank account or crypto wallet or whatever you happen to use to receive and manage your funds. You need to make sure that that's set up and that it's working fine before you receive the funds, obviously. And to be sure, you want to make sure you do that well ahead of time. So you do that even before you begin approaching investors. It's a small bureaucratic task that doesn't take a long time. Usually, it depends on your context, of course, where you're located, which account you're setting up. If you're opening up an account from overseas in another country, it may take you longer, even days, weeks, or sometimes months. But in most cases, it's a matter of hours or days. And of course, if you have a crypto wallet, it's basically instantaneous. So it depends on what you want to use for your funds management. Now, for your marketing benchmarks, you'll want to establish certain goals for the benchmarks, right? You want to have definitive benchmarks that are measurable, that you can point to and say, right, we are here on the roadmap, on the timeline. We want to get to there at a certain point. And in between, we need to have these benchmarks hit, or there are our targets that we need to measure by. And they are not the milestones. They are different, benchmarks and milestones. Benchmarks are the things you measure by. They're the standard by which you measure against. And milestones are the targets that you have. And once you hit those targets, then you've achieved that milestone. Until you hit that target, you have not achieved that milestone. So again, benchmarks are the standard by which you measure. Milestones are the targets along the timeline that you use. So a benchmark might be measuring the number of views on a page or open rates in an email. And you measure the benchmark to see what your open rates are as your standard definition. It could be yours. You might be using industry averages. You might be using dynamic numbers that change on the fly within your organization, especially if you start out at zero and you see that your numbers are changing drastically over the days and weeks and months. You might, again, use averages from within known companies that you're aware of in similar niche that have, for some reason, known benchmarks. Maybe you have worked in another company with similar benchmarks. Maybe someone else in your organization has, and you can use their knowledge from that other organization in which they worked in order to create those benchmarks. Whatever it is, write your benchmarks down. Make sure you include all the stakeholders. If you're a solo operation, again, great, still write it down, because as time passes, you may cease to be a solo operation and your operation may scale. You may need other people. You want to make sure everyone that needs to know all of the relevant details that they need to know about this process. The more people are involved, the better off you are at reaching your goal if the stakeholders have buy-in. If the stakeholders do not have buy-in, you're far less likely to reach your targets, your milestones, and you're going to be less likely to succeed because people are not aware necessarily of the goals or of the benchmarks by which they're being measured. That's why you need to mark down the goals and the benchmarks and the milestones, as well as all the other definitions mentioned in the previous video, and questions and answers and lists, etc. So once you have those measurable benchmarks in place, and they could be whatever you need as benchmarks, again, email open rates, views on a page, calls to actions activated, secondary actions, meetings, having taken place, the number of meetings that you need to have take place. Right, the precise number is actually a goal in terms of what you want to achieve. But the benchmarks are the standards by which you must measure in order to test whether or not you have reached your goals and whether or not you have hit the milestones along the timeline. And then, of course, there are the milestones. And the milestones are, again, basically your goals for each step along the way. So whenever you hit one, it should be a notable piece of information. Some of them deserve a big deal. Some of them deserve a big announcement. They don't necessarily all deserve such an announcement, but you should be at least making your community aware, if there is a community you can make aware, whether it's only internally in the company or whether it involves people externally too. You can measure your benchmarks, and if you've hit your milestones by a certain date or even beforehand, or if it's late, make some fanfare out of it, or send an announcement, send an email updating people as to why you hit that benchmark. You slammed that milestone and dunked that goal before or on time or after. The more you make your stakeholders aware of all your achievements and how and why they were done at the time that they were done, the better off you will be. And that is it for now. After marketing.